Welcome to Praxis, I'm Bronwyn Adcock. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney today and also those joining us from Honiara, Dili and Port Moresby. And welcome to those of you watching on APAC, online or listening on radio. Today we're discussing labour mobility in the Pacific. International migration in the Asia-Pacific region is now happening at an unprecedented level. Each year more than 3 million people leave their homes to find work in a new country. This movement of people can provide a huge opportunity for developing nations. Worldwide last year, people working overseas sent $450 billion back home. These remittances are a large source of foreign exchange. For some countries, like Tonga, remittances make up as much as a quarter of GDP. But is there a better way for developing nations to harness the benefits from migration and remittances? And what has been the impact on Pacific Island communities of the recently established seasonal worker programs in Australia and New Zealand? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined now by our panellists. Joining us today, we have Mai Malaulau, a labour migration specialist at the World Bank. Lisa Caho from Ikale Contractors, an approved employer for the Australian seasonal worker program that recruits workers from Tonga and Tuvalu. And Luke Craven from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. Luke, I'll start with you if I can.
Sure.
Migration is not new for the Pacific. What are the most recent trends? Who's moving and where are they going?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that migration has a long history in the Pacific that goes decades back, and it has largely been focused on Polynesia. So Polynesians moving through things like the Pacific Access category or other skilled migration programs, predominantly to New Zealand and somewhat to Australia as well. Melanesia has not really been a big part of that story until very recently, and the seasonal worker programs, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about today, are the main opportunity for countries like the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and PNG to engage in labour mobility in the area, both within the Pacific Islands and to Australia and New Zealand.
Mai, there's a new World Bank report that's just come out that's looking at strategies to address employment challenges faced by the Pacific, and it's pointed towards greater labour mobility as one solution. Why is this?
I think the words as one solution is pretty important to remember, and that is that labour mobility is really a subset of a broader, what should be national employment strategies, which include domestic employment. And part and parcel of domestic employment is also looking at local industries within Pacific Island countries and continuing to build and develop private sector and economies, local economies in Pacific Island countries so that they can deliver employment nationally. Beyond that, national employment strategy should also be looking at opportunities further abroad. I think it's fairly well accepted that as much as you might develop local industries in Pacific Island countries, that it's unlikely, highly unlikely, that they will deliver the level of employment that would be necessary in order for people to have opportunities for income earning employment.
Remittances are clearly one of the largest and most obvious benefits of migration. It's a flow of money where otherwise there might be none. Mai, can you paint a picture for me of how a community benefits when they're receiving these flows of money?
I think remittances is one source, and remittances has been important, particularly there are countries that Pacific people have gravitated towards, Australia, New Zealand and the US. And that's been a long-standing thing, and there have been several generations now of Pacific Island people in those countries who have had children, and their children have had children, and have continued to send remittances home. And those remittances have contributed to education, they've contributed to a range of consumption goods as well. I think those are important because the money gets pumped back into economies. And I think the important thing to remember about remittances is that, there's been some talk about, and we had a conversation earlier on about remittances being particularly vulnerable as a source of income for countries. And research has shown that alongside other types of income, foreign exchange income, remittances have been remarkably resilient in terms of, in the face of economic shocks, particularly those that we've seen more recently. And so Remittances sits alongside, however, a range of other things. And if we're talking, for example, about temporary migration, then we're talking about the transfer of skills back into home countries. People go off abroad, they work, they develop skills, they might even get an education and develop qualifications, and they bring that home. Yeah. So it's not just remittances; it's what they're used for and how people use their remittances, whether it be for education or house building. But it's also the transfer of skills when they come back, and also the way in which they socialise and the expectations that they bring home in terms of their own countries and economies and governance in their home countries.
Luke, what do you think is the story of remittances? Is it an overwhelmingly positive story?
Look, I think for the most part it is. I mean, the focus of my own research is more at the local level. So while at an aggregate or national level, those remittances may be incredibly resilient, I think it's important to paint or tell the story at a very local level. So for instance, a rural community in Vanuatu who is largely dependent on remittances for the majority of their cash incomes is really, really vulnerable to changes in migration policy at an Australian or New Zealand level. And they're also really, really vulnerable to what's going to happen if an employer decides that they'd like to extend migration opportunities to other communities and not just the one that they've been engaging with since the inception of the scheme in 2007. So I think, and we were talking earlier about whether remittances foster reliance or whether they foster dependence. And I think to a large extent, it depends on context and it depends on the particular community that you're talking about. Where I think we need to be most wary about reliance or dependence is in particularly rural areas in Melanesia, so in Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, where remittances are really the only opportunity that people have to meet their cash income needs.
Does the whole community benefit from remittances? If there's, for example, a quarter of that community are bringing in remittances, does the money go to everyone?
Yes and no. I think sure there are some kind of multiplier effect where people are spending in the community and other people are benefiting through the growth of business, etc. But community leaders in Vanuatu will tell you that there is kind of a growing gap between those that migrate and those that don't migrate. And that's because it is a huge cash injection for those households that do migrate. And it's also migration's positively selected. So what I mean by that is if you're living in a rural community in Vanuatu, it's going to probably cost you $300 or $400 at the outset even to have the opportunity to go, because you're going to have to commute or travel to Port Vila probably twice to get a passport to meet the visa requirements to be able to go. And so households that don't have that upfront capital in the first place aren't getting as much benefit as other households in the community.
Lisa, what have you seen on the ground in terms of the benefits or otherwise of remittances coming into a community?
In Tonga, for example, church, religion plays a major factor in the lives of all Tongan families. We are seeing that no longer the families ringing up relatives that are already living overseas. They're actually taking out a member of their family, and they're able to come and work, and they're able to remit back monies that goes back into the community, whether it's building a hall for the youth, or if it's helping with the construction of a church, or so it is a big advantage for the Tongan communities that I've seen. It's helping, like they're also getting school buses. You've got the town officers bringing together a village, and they're actually pulling together and saying, look, we've got people that are members of our community that are going out into this into the scheme or into the New Zealand workforce, and then where should we pull together and we can get a school bus that'll come to our village and take our school children out to the schools. So
we've referred a couple of times already to the seasonal worker programs that have been set up in Australia and New Zealand. Mai, I know that you've been very involved and the World Bank has been very involved since the outset. Can you explain for me about these programs? Where are they operating and how do they work?
Okay, the seasonal worker program in New Zealand is called the Recognised Seasonal Employer Scheme. The Australia program is called the Seasonal Worker Program. This New Zealand program has been going since 2006-2007 and has a, I think, target of 8,000 last I checked. 2,500 is the Australia target, and it's focused on agriculture, so farms, and people come out to pick apples, almonds, and a range of other type crops in farms. And in both countries, the governments of New Zealand and Australia are working with Pacific Island country governments to actually facilitate that, make the policy settings, etc.
Lisa, as an employer, can you give us a picture of what it's like for the businesses in Australia? How do they see the scheme and how well does it work?
Well, I'm based in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. We recruit over, in 1 year, between 120 to 150, and they're placed in the 3 areas that we supply labourers for growers. The communities that they live amongst, there has been a very good positive feedback from them. They are the Pacific seasonal workers. They come and they participate. They're involved, and they're using everything that any other normal Australian worker would use. They're using our banks. They're using our supermarkets, and so it is a win-win. They're not just coming here and making their monies and leaving, or they're not just coming and making monies and sending it back to their home countries. Yes, they're very actively involved in all community aspects of whichever community that they're staying and living and working with.
And Luke, what about the impacts on the communities back home? I know you've done some research and others have into that. What's happening in the communities that these workers are coming from?
Well, I guess the most noticeable impact is the way that they're investing their money in material goods. So over the past 7 or 8 years, there's been an explosion in the construction of concrete houses and the acquisition of water tanks and solar panels. And anecdotally, village chiefs will tell you that, where 10 years ago the community would have been lit on kerosene, that just isn't happening anymore, and everyone is using the solar panels that they have. I guess the main impact is that, and I know Lisa and I were talking about this earlier, that the opportunity to achieve higher rungs of education is now an option for a lot of children of migrant families. So in Vanuatu in particular, high school education isn't a particularly cheap enterprise. It costs about 2,000 New Zealand dollars per child per year above year 9. And the majority of migrants are choosing to spend a large portion of their money on education for their children or children within their wider family network. And that's a great outcome. And I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of that human capital flow through.
And have there been any costs to the community that you have seen, Luke?
I mean, sure. I think it depends who you speak to in the community. So there's definitely a generational divide in how people view the scheme. So for the younger generation, they're really excited about it. It's an opportunity for them to travel and to come to Australia and New Zealand, and they're quite westernised, really. Where you get a little bit more pessimism is from the older generations and from community leaders, who are particularly concerned about the way that migrants contribute to the community as a whole. So in rural Vanuatu, most of the way that communities are governed is still in very informal ways and through traditional mechanisms. And there is a little bit of feedback that I've received that migrants are less willing to abide by the rules that chiefs set. They think, well, I've earned my money overseas, I've made that contribution to the community, and so I don't need to contribute in other ways. Those problems aren't immutable. I think there are definitely ways that employers, governments and workers themselves can work together to make the scheme better. I mean, one of my main pieces of feedback is that village councils and chiefs need to be really involved in recruitment processes so that they can say if someone's not contributing to the community, well, I think we should give someone else the opportunity to go.
What happens to those who are left behind for this duration? Who looks after the crops at home and cares for the children and does those basic things?
When we first started recruiting, we did tend to bring out the younger generation. But then when we brought them out, They were tending to wanting to test and experience everything that Australia had to offer. So then we left the older generation back there, the elderly father who couldn't really tend to their crops and that. So then we had one example when the older son came here. There was no one to tend for his plantation. When he went back, it was all overgrown. So then we started to recruit from the older generation, and we left the younger ones back at home to tend to those things. So it's working now. What we're doing, we're bringing the older ones in.
And I think also different countries have picked up different practices about how they deal with the absence of either mothers, fathers, or people who have traditionally worked on farms and plantations who are no longer there. And I know that there are some examples where people have been selected to travel abroad on these programs, that there are requirements on them to actually, plant X number of taro or X number of things before they leave. And then to actually engage again on their return home. And that'll vary between village, between country, etc. But there are examples of where people have actually tried to, compensate or mitigate the impacts of absence.
I think the interesting thing with the impact on agriculture is that a lot of migrants don't view it as a huge problem, because the remittances that they're earning enable them to buy food from market or to buy imported food. And so it's not actually meaning that they can't put food on the table. I think the concern is one around health, and I know there's wider concerns around the growing rate of diabetes in the region, and that's because people are eating far, far more rice than they would have done 10 or 12 years ago. And I think it's also around the market volatility around imported food. So, a bag of rice in rural Vanuatu can fluctuate about 200% in price depending on what the international market conditions are doing and whether the boat came on a given day. So there are concerns about how that does impact food security on different levels.
Mm-hmm. And if I just might also pick up on the issue of skill transference, I think one of the things that was floated when these schemes started is that it might be possible that people would go abroad, work in New Zealand, work in Australia, and bring those skills back to apply to their farms. Now, I think it's been shown that actually it's quite a different proposition to work on a New Zealand farm with all the mechanised, machinery, etc., that go into that, and then to come back and try and apply that, particularly to the differences in crops as well. And so I think this is an area that also might be good to continue to look at in terms of what kinds of skills might be able to be brought back. Obviously, you're bringing back the disciplines and the work ethics of, getting up in the morning at a set time and coming home at a set time and working for a set number of hours, which, obviously in the Pacific countries they don't do because it gets too hot at some parts of the day. And they're bringing back some of those more softer skills. But the kinds of skills that we hoped, that countries hoped at one point in time would be transferable, hasn't yet yielded, and that's not yet come round. So I think this is an area too where, whether in the agricultural sector or hopefully in other sectors that open up in Australia and New Zealand, where that kind of skill transference could be fostered.
Well, I know that the New Zealand government is really keen to see the development of skills programs. They have a pilot program called the Wakamasina, which is around the transfer of softer skills, but predominantly around things like budgeting, how to set up a small business and how to run a small business. The kind of skills that workers don't get just by working in agriculture or horticulture in New Zealand or Australia, but the kind of skills that are really important if remittances are going to have the most positive impact that they can. So I think that's probably an area where host governments and reception governments can work together to kind of create these programs that might be able to foster these soft skills.
Yeah, just to add on to Luke, the seasonal workers program, they've actually got add-on skills training now, and so we as approved employers, we are able to place our Pacific seasonal workers into to go in and do add-on skills training, which will be in basic numeracy and literacy, computing, first aid, and those three key areas we've seen. We did the first one back in 2012, and there was great improvements, and it was very good for us as approved employees, seeing our workers being able there to go in and learn basic things such as budgeting. Should we spend $200 on a pair of Nike shoes compared to should we budget that $200 and buy food and leave a little bit left over for transport or send some money back to our families. So yes, like Luke was saying, the Australian one has add-on skills training already in place.
Looking to the future of the program, Mai, how do you think it can be expanded or grown so that there is an increase in an uptake from workers and local employers?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the Australia program in particular is a program that I think we all wish and hope will expand. I think that there's scope there, and we'd like to think there's scope there so that it actually expands to the level of the New Zealand program. But with these programs, there are a lot of things that need to be in place in order for that to happen. Demand needs to be there, and we talked a little bit about that. The policy settings need to be right, so that Pacific workers might, have the opportunity to pick up some of those opportunities in the market. At the moment, I think that there are a number of areas where they're competing with others in terms of the Australia scheme. So, just in general, I think it would be good if we could continue to knock on that door, because I think that that's a door that, that's already open to Pacific countries, is the agricultural area. And there is already, some work and some knowledge around that already about the possible areas that we might look into in terms of expansion of that. But beyond that, I think to look beyond sectors, so beyond agriculture. Where is there demand in Australia, in New Zealand, or maybe even beyond Australia and New Zealand, but in this instance I'm focusing on Australia and New Zealand. Where might there be demand in these countries that are the biggest neighbours for the Pacific Island countries? And of course with all the caveats around, so long as we're not displacing workers, and so long as there is demand, and so long, all of those kinds of caveats, exploring broader sectors. Where Pacific countries might be able to, even with a bit of training, so upskilling perhaps, whereby the countries might be able to work together to give people qualifications or skills that might be able to grant them access into more semi-skilled areas perhaps. So I think that there's prospect in terms of expansion of schemes to look at both sectors as well as, the expansion in existing sector, but also beyond the existing sector into other sectors.
Yeah, just to add on to Mai, I think a big main contributing factor in making this program expand is the competition that we've got. As an approved employer, I've been in this industry for over 10 years. I've only been an approved employer for about 4 to 5 years. We are competing against illegal immigrants. We are competing against the backpackers. With the introduction of the backpackers being able to get their second year visa grants, so they're able to stay on a lot longer than they used to before, there will be competition. But the program, the Pacific Seasonal Workers Program does work because of the reliability of the workers that we are able to bring. The productivity is there as well. For instance, before the program was put in place, we were bringing in labourers from all facets of walks of life, just to be able to fill in the spots that we needed to fill in. And this included everyone and anyone that wanted to come in and do a bit of work. But over the time now that the program has been put in place, we're able to move away from that, and we've got the reliability there from the Pacific Seasonal Workers. For the growers, they're able to focus more on the growth of their business. So just continue on from what Mai said. I think that's how we can probably expand the program.
Luke, how do you see the program could be improved for the workers and the communities, in particular the communities they come from? I know that you have a vision of this kind of program being integrated with an aid program?
Yeah, look, I think the problem, and again I speak from experience in Vanuatu here, is that there's not the greatest opportunity for workers to contribute to local development themselves. There needs to be some kind of infrastructural buy-in, either by the Australian or New Zealand governments or by the World Bank, for instance, around facilitating the use of these remittances. So an example I always come back to is around rural electrification. If there isn't an electricity source on rural islands in Melanesia, then migrants aren't going to be able to use their remittances to start industries or to fuel industries. Likewise, education is very expensive, and we know from a lot of studies that that's what migrants are spending their money on. If that was cheaper, so for instance, like the New Zealand and Australian governments did, underwriting the cost of primary education in the region, if they were to do that with secondary education, or at least make some contribution to it, then I think migrants would have more money to spend on other things. So I think that's the most important thing in the first instance. The second thing to say is that I think skills uptake is really important, because again, I don't think that the agricultural skills that Mai was talking about are making a huge impact at home. So we need to increase these skills programs, but also probably talk about opening up skilled migration pathways to people that are participating. Because if you're spending 6 or 7 years upskilling people while they're an agricultural worker, you're going to reach a point at which they don't want to work in that sector anymore because you've given them skills to do something else. We need to make sure that those pathways are in place so that that can continue as well.
Mai, what do you think? Is this something that the World Bank could work with in the future?
I can't speak for the bank, but I think one of the things that I'd like to pick up on in terms of what Luke said is there's enormous almost, difficulties with Pacific people who, even if you've got a qualification that might be able to be used in Australia, for example, you still might not qualify by virtue of some immigration requirements that require your skills and experience to be recognised in Australia. And so there are areas whereby, if the countries really need to sit down and see where the borders and immigration borders can be relaxed. Well, not even relaxed, we're talking about facilitated in order to have Pacific countries fill unmet need in Australia and New Zealand. And in each of these cases, we're not talking about bringing people in that might compete with local markets in Australia and New Zealand. We're really talking about bringing people in who are needed, where there is a gap, where Pacific countries can actually, potentially meet that gap with a little bit of upskilling. Yeah. And in order for that to happen, then I think the policy settings in receiving countries like Australia and New Zealand really need to be, worked with so that that can be facilitated more easily.
And if I can just perhaps jump back in, I think the other thing to say is that it's really important to involve employers in how the program operates for workers back home. So, for instance, a New Zealand employer has recently established a joint venture with the community so that there's a coffee plantation that they own jointly with the community that workers can flow back and work on while they're not in New Zealand.
So this is a community in Vanuatu?
Yes, in Vanuatu. It's on the island of Tanna. So the idea is that there aren't that many jobs for RSE workers to do back in Vanuatu, and this provides one opportunity for that. And because of the huge kind of capital input you need to make in these kind of industries to get them started, I think there's an important role for employers to play in that process as well.
Okay, all right, it's time to move to questions from the floor. We have a question first of all from Dilly, from Ismenio da Silva. How can we increase the number of seasonal workers in Australia, given that it's so much lower than New Zealand? How do we address the challenges in terms of competition with backpackers? Something you've touched on, Lisa.
Yes. Yes, like I said, this industry, the horticulture industry, we're in tomatoes, cucumbers and almonds. This industry is predominantly battled out by illegal immigrants. Maybe if there was a cohesive working of government departments in trying to coerce out these illegal immigrants. We've got cowboys. They are That's what we term as employees that go around sourcing out illegal immigrants. These kind of things have to be kind of weeded out of this industry to make it more successful for the increase of Pacific seasonal workers and backpackers.
Mai, what do you think? How can the number of seasonal workers in Australia be increased?
As I say, there are a number of things that are constraining demand in Australia, and Lisa's already alluded to, the illegal migrants, etc. And we're led to believe that also, employers in Australia need to be able to come to the table. And one of the things that constrains their ability to come to the table, as we a little while ago, about 8 months ago, we went around and spoke to some of these employers. And one of the things that constrains their ability is that they claim there's an enormous amount of capital that goes into being a seasonal employer. And that capital comes about because they have to provide things like accommodation. Accommodation for workers is not readily available in Australia, and so the employers that we went to see showed us, actually houses that were built in order to house workers. And the capital outlay for that is not, is an upfront cost that employers need to wear. And so the attractiveness of the scheme to all employers may be impeded, therefore, because of things like that, as well as the factors that that Lisa's already talked about.
Okay, we've got a question now from PNG. What would be the impacts of seasonal worker schemes on the population of PNG, especially the youth, in a country where youth unemployment is at an all-time high?
Maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it offers a real opportunity to provide jobs for some of those youth without employment. I know Lisa and I were talking earlier about the fact that employers do prefer workers from the older generation because they do have that greater maturity that makes them easier to work with once they're in Australia or New Zealand. So I think that's the first thing. It does offer a safety valve, so to speak, to offer employment. But I don't think it's the sole fix. And I don't think we should think of labour migration as the sole fix to youth unemployment in the region, because it's not, and it requires more sort of softer aid and private sector development to get industries going locally.
Okay. Now, do we have any questions in Sydney?
There are 3 or 4 comments I have. Firstly, I think it's obvious that labour mobility is not going to help economic development generally in these Pacific islands. It can help a little bit, but it can't solve the problems of development. So it's only one aspect. I think Luke mentioned we have to think about aid, etc., to help as well. Second thing is, most migrants who come tend to be more skilled in some sense or more enterprising. I think Luke mentioned they have to have a certain amount of assets or money to get around to get visas and passports. So you're depleting the population from those countries in some sense of some, quote, better quality workers maybe. The third thing is, I think someone should be studying, and maybe already do it, of looking at people who go back home. What do they actually do? And do they actually move into formal employment, or do they just go back onto the farms and do roughly what they used to do before? And that's a study maybe you do already in the bank or might want to do in the future. The last point, well, 2 more I guess. Last but one, is that given that the long term one thinks that global warming is taking place, is anything being done to mitigate some of the possible problems that might arise? And again, aid might be something which can help in that direction. And the last but not least thing is, of course, detention centres have been providing some employment, and I hope they don't expand too much. Thank you.
Just pick up on one of those points. Luke, what do seasonal workers do when they return to their communities?
Again, I can only really speak to the community that I did my own research in, but I think there is a problem that there really isn't that formal sector employment for them to enter into when they return. So one of 2 things occurs. Either they treat the RSE or the SWP like a de facto job. So they think, well, I only have to work 6 months a year to provide a level of income that provides for my family the year round. So they will just cycle on and off, 6 months at home, 6 months away. And that's fairly common. And I think that's a concerning trend because, as I alluded to earlier, that's not going to be there forever. There are factors that can change the opportunity to migrate, and that puts those families and those communities in a real risky position. The second thing is that they do move into small business. The problem then is that you have the duplication of the same small business in the same community. So for instance, you'll have 7 or 8 of the same small store selling the same essentials, or if you go to Port Vila, a lot of migrants just buy a van, which is a taxi type business, and they run that. And, people joke that Port Vila has the best public transport in the world because there are so many of these businesses being set up, and it's really just not a very, very good allocation of those remittances into small business.
Mai, would you like to respond? I mean, another issue that came up then, I guess, is the idea of a brain drain, and that the best and brightest from a country end up leaving on these migration programs. Is that an issue, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a well-known fact that people who have skills and have qualifications and have the opportunity to migrate obviously can choose to do that more easily than others. And most countries will not constrain their nationals, and in fact all countries will not constrain or prohibit their nationals from doing so, and I think that's just right. But in terms of brain drain, I think the flip side is that in a lot of Pacific Island countries there's a brain surplus. Yeah, so that you've got people who are highly skilled and highly qualified who are sitting in Pacific Island countries with nowhere to go and no jobs to go to, because the jobs that are actually in line with the qualifications that they have aren't available nationally. Yeah? And so, in terms of brain drain, there's always been that factor, and I think it's an important factor to bear in mind. But the answer to that must surely be to train up people within those areas for which each country has a shortage, and to train them up in abundance, so that they can choose. Those who choose to migrate can migrate. Those who choose to stay can stay, rather than to put in place some other measures that actually constrain their movement in some way.
Lisa, does Tonga suffer from a brain drain, do you think?
I think it does in a way. We're seeing that, like I mentioned before, the nurses where you've got your blue uniforms and your pink uniforms.
And what does that mean?
I think the blue uniforms, I think they're lower in rank to the pink uniform nurses. Once you've reached your pink uniform, that's your ticket out of there. So everyone's all like running up the ladder trying to get this pink uniform to fit them so they can fit the category to fly out and leave Tonga. So, but then we do also have the pink uniformed people that are wanting to just go and upskill, learn better from overseas, and then take that back to their home countries. But then, and they're also doing that in the education sector. They're introducing like bachelor programs, and that's also similar to this blue-pink syndrome that's happening in the nursing.
Okay, I've got a question now from Honiara for Luke. What has made the difference in Vanuatu to catalyse recent increases in migration? What factors have supported participation?
Well, I think because the RSC in particular is an employer-led scheme.
This is the New Zealand program.
The New Zealand program. So, I mean, simply put, there were existing connections in the country to New Zealand. So, in the community that I was in, they had a missionary whose nephew worked in the community, who also knew that there was an employer in New Zealand that had a labour shortage, and ta-da, you have a gap filled. And I think that's the difficulty, is that these schemes are designed so that employers will be able to fill gaps, rather than the focus being on the governments like the Vanuatu government or the Solomon Islands government being able to say to New Zealand, look, we have these workers available, what can you do with them? And so I think you do need those existing connections in place to facilitate the growth of these kind of programs.
Okay, we'll go now to a question from Sydney. There's a gentleman over here.
Hello, my name is Charles and I'm a student at UTS. I guess I have about 2 or 3 questions. The first one is, look, when you're recommending aid, for example, have you considered the fact that probably we have structures in place that can be able to disseminate this aid in a way that people can benefit, or are we going to see the artifacts of aid, which is corruption and all those things? The second aspect is it casual When you say that you're now happy bringing in older generation as opposed to younger, how sustainable is that going forward? Are you happy to have older people who can work lesser years and go back home, or younger generation who can be trained and in the long run, I mean, the program can be sustainable in the long run? I was wondering from the World Bank's perspective whether there is any research that says this migration should be encouraged long term, or we should try to build structures back there that can be able to sustain life over there. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with the first question to Luke. You were talking about aid and how aid can work with this kind of scheme. Is corruption an issue, do you think?
Of course it is, and I think there's no doubt that the Pacific has really, really high levels of corruption that probably do impact or does impact upon the effectiveness of aid. Saying that, I don't think that precludes us from working on governance and building governance structures so that that is mitigated to some extent. I think that you can't just point the finger at corruption and say because that government is corrupt or because we're worried about the aid money, where it's going to go, that we're not going to give that aid money or we're not going to invest long term in those programs. Because otherwise I think you will see a greater level of dependence or reliances on remittances.
Lisa, the question the gentleman brought up was about the recruitment of older workers rather than younger workers. Yes. Is that a long-term solution? What about when these workers get to an age where it doesn't suit them as much? And what do the younger workers do in the meantime?
Well, it is only just a personal view from how we've been recruiting. It was only on the view that the younger generation, like Luke was saying, they are more westernized, and then when they come over here, they're just imitating everything that they see, whether it's through the media, and they want to come and see and touch and feel and do all of those things. Whereas the older generation, when they've come out here, they've already travelled overseas, so they're a lot more mature and they've got more a sense of a goal in place, and they want to reach those goals. Whereas the younger generation that we've brought out, they tend to lose the focus when they come over here to work.
Mm. Just following on from that, this is to all the panel, is there a problem with the seasonal workers program in that they target a certain kind of worker? For example, there appears to be that men do it more than women, and there's a certain age group. Is it a work opportunity that's not actually open to the entire population?
I guess yes. I mean, obviously, people working in agriculture need to meet a certain physical standard, and when workers or employers are recruiting, they do make people undertake physical assessments to prove that they could do the job. I think the second thing to say there is that, there's a big gender gap. While we were talking earlier about the fact that women do get involved in the scheme and they do work in pack houses predominantly, those opportunities probably only extend to 10% of the entire RSE workforce. So yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Mai, turning now to the part of the question for you. The gentleman was asking, it's one thing to work on labour mobility, but is it not better to actually work at building the economy within the Pacific community?
Okay, I think you need to do both.
Yeah.
It's important to do both. Labour mobility, I think, when you look at Pacific Island countries, the one thing that we have in abundance in Pacific Island countries is people. Relative to other areas that we could be trading on, and you need to both be looking at building industries and private sector industries and employment back home, but also we live in a global environment, and Pacific Island countries are not exempt to that, and people will want to, being human beings, move to areas where they think that they might be better off either by way of employment or salary. But it's not just about salary. I think, I said before that the decision to move is actually informed by a number of things. And often people might be enticed to stay home if they felt there was something that they could do, if there were opportunities back home that they could actually put themselves and their skills to. Yeah? So I think you need to do both.
Okay, we've got a question now from Timor, from Frederico. Are there any strong laws in Australia to provide sanctions to the employers that employ illegal workers? Lisa, this is probably your...
Yes,
your
before it was on the onus of whoever, if you were caught employing illegal immigrants, and then so you had the responsibility and the onus to pay whatever that was given out to you by, I think, maybe Department of Immigration. But now it's more, it's shifted. It's more on the employers who directly bring in illegal immigrants, as well as the grower now. So we've got the grower above us, and then so we're the ones bringing in the labourers. So we're not going to be the only ones in trouble. The grower is also going to be in strife as well.
There's no point in having strong regulations unless there's someone there to enforce them. And I think that's the main concern at the moment, is that people know that they shouldn't be hiring illegal workers or paying backpackers below award wage, but they can, and so they will. And unless we address that, we're not going to see a huge paradigm shift towards workers from the Pacific.
Okay, and do we have another question from Sydney? Yes?
Hi, I'm Samantha from the World Bank here. I've got a question about the role of labour liaison officers, like that the Philippines have a lot of and really promote to help with the facilitation and day-to-day looking after the workers, just in terms of monitoring their medical, housing, everything like that.
Obviously, Tonga is one of the countries that actually has liaison officers based in Australia or New Zealand. Actually, probably more New Zealand than Australia. But it's quite expensive. It's expensive to have people who are based overseas and to have them travel up and down the country, looking after however many workers that you've got there. And so not all the countries can afford it. However, having said that, it is an important function. And it's a function that countries recognise is an area of weakness for them, but it's not one that they can all resource readily.
A lot of employers start to fill that gap, is that they have a preference that there's a community leader from the community in, say, Vanuatu or Tonga brought over as part of the larger group, who all the group respect, and for the group to funnel any of their concerns through, kind of like a default labour union representative, so to speak. And so that kind of informally starts to fill that gap, because I agree with Mai, it's just probably too expensive to have a staff member there all the time.
I also wanted to pick up just one thing on diaspora. We had a conversation before about, and many people have asked me, so why does Tonga do so well in Australia? You know, Tonga is probably about 80% of the seasonal worker program. Is that right, Jesse? And they've asked, why do they do so well? And my answer has always been, and it's not a scientific evidence-based one that I've gone and researched, but diaspora. Tonga's diaspora in Australia is very active, and that diaspora play a number of roles. They actually identify areas where demand is available and then relay that home. But also beyond that, when people are in the country, they can help to support workers while they're here. And it's a double-edged thing. Sometimes they help to support and sometimes they're not that helpful. But there we go. I think that there is something to be said about utilising diaspora.
Okay, and we have another question from the lady up the back here in Sydney.
Thank you. I'm Ruth Colajori from the University of Sydney, from the Menzies Centre for Health Policy. And I just like to address this to all or any of the panellists, but health hasn't been mentioned except in passing. And labour mobility and health is certainly not my area of research or particular interest, but I do understand that there is reasonable evidence that it can be quite deleterious to health. And I'm thinking of, in terms of things, I think lifestyle, picking up unhealthy lifestyle habits is an obvious one. I mean, smoking, alcohol, fast food, and so on and so forth. But also things like sexually transmitted diseases and then mental health issues like family breakdown, absent parents, children being brought up kind of by different people, loss of family cohesion and therefore community cohesion, and the effect that has on mental health. So I'm wondering if anybody would mind commenting on that, please.
Yes, there are issues surrounding health. and I guess we're looking at the existing schemes. The Australia and New Zealand scheme require workers to all have compulsory health insurance, and so while they're in country, they will receive health treatment for any of the ailments. In fact, some of the complaints I've received is that now they've got access to doctors and easy access to prescriptions, etc. They're going to the doctors all the time. So they're making the best use of their health insurance, which is a good thing. Yeah. But as you say, people will indulge in areas which might bring about sexually transmitted diseases. I'm thinking also particularly about beyond agriculture, about seafarers. And I think there's been some study to show that that's been an issue with regard to the seafaring labour migration population. And so these things are very real. And as well, I think you also mentioned the issues about, people at home and the stress that places on people at home. And we've got some ways to go in Pacific Island countries in terms of addressing issues or even knowing about the issues relating to families that are of workers who are left at home. And there isn't nearly enough known or probably done about the issues and stresses upon families that are left behind.
Lisa, what have you seen about the impacts on families? Particularly, I guess they're now families who are mainly headed by women, because as we've discussed, the men are mainly the ones taking up the job opportunities. What happens to the health, in particular, of the families who are left behind?
Well, the health of the families that are left behind, they do generally fare well, because remittances are made on a regular basis. But mentally, physically, emotionally, the support's not there. Yes, you've got your extended families and that'll do come in and pitch in, but like I say, for instances, the wives, when they're left over there with their children, their husbands, their rock, their main support, they're over here. So maybe the program should offer maybe support mechanisms for families that are back over there for those instances. We've got younger generation that have come out, and we see mental health has been on the rise. They don't cope well. For a lot of them, it's their first times away from family members, from their own family units, from their comforts that they're used to. We had some workers that just could not operate. They just turned into like zombies, and we had to help them seek medical help. Yes, the impacts of remittances back to the families, they can, increase awareness for the families back there that they can access health, but the ones mentally, emotionally needs more support.
If I can just jump in quickly as well, I think, yeah, absolutely, Ruth, all of the problems that you listed probably do occur in some respect or to some extent. And I think that's an area that probably should be researched in more depth. I guess just to flip your question on its head a little bit as well, I think remittances do provide a really useful mechanism for families to be able to pay for healthcare in the Pacific. So again, only anecdotally, but I know a family that was able to afford cancer treatment for a family member because they had remittances going into the bank account. And that's an opportunity that wouldn't have been available to them had they not migrated. So I think there's a give and a take on that kind of spectrum.
Okay, I've got a question now from Honiara. The main barriers to labour mobility are political. How can the Pacific influence politics in Australia and New Zealand to increase labour mobility? Who'd like to take that one? Luke?
I guess that's an incredibly difficult question. And I think the difference between outcomes in New Zealand and Australia are probably in part because of the differences in the political climate. And it's no secret that we have a little bit of a toxic discourse around migration in Australia. And I think that definitely plays into the way that the scheme operates, and it definitely plays into the way that politicians are willing to expend political capital on making these kind of schemes work. Because it's very easy to flip those or spin those in the media as migration schemes that are going to steal jobs from Australians, right? So that is a challenge. I think that saying that, Australia and New Zealand are very committed to development in the Pacific, and they're committed to labour mobility. But it's about developing schemes that do meet the demand in countries so that we don't have these kind of political problems.
Okay, we've got time for one very quick question from Sydney in the front row.
You touched briefly on some of the factors affecting demand in the seasonal worker program and in the RSC. So I guess my question relates to this. There's a political economist at the University of Oxford named Martin Roos, who has argued that there's an implicit trade-off between openness to admitting migrant workers and some of the rights granted to migrants after admission. So in the context of labour mobility in the Pacific, have the major recipient countries achieved the correct balance between openness and rights?
Mai, can you take that one fairly briefly?
Well, openness and rights. I think one of the things that I know the New Zealand scheme looked to do was ensure that migrants that came in under the recognised seasonal employer scheme had the same rights, recourse, etc., that other nationals had. Yeah, I think where the difference is that they don't have recourse to social security type arrangements, yeah, and that's why they need to take out private health insurance, etc. But in terms of employment standards, in terms of all of those other things that pertain to workers and people who are living in a country, then there is a requirement that they be afforded the same rights as nationals. Yeah.
Okay. Fortunately, we have to finish up there. It brings us to the end of our discussion. Can we please thank our panellists, Mai Malaulau, Luke Craven and Lisa Caho. I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us here in Sydney and from afar. And remember, you can watch this or any of our previous discussions online. Just search for World Bank and Praxis and follow us on Twitter with the hashtag #PacificPraxis. Until next time, I'm Bronwyn Adcock. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.